Right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on our Emerging Research Workshop Report, Cultivating Equity in STEM Through Inclusive Language. I'm Heather Metcalf, PI for the ARC Network. And before we introduce today's guests, I would like to just take care of a few housekeeping items. First, I want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording with registrants and post it to our ARC Network website after the webinar is completed. Live captioning is available through Zoom. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options. To the right is the icon for captioning. Selecting the caret will allow you to customize your captioning. In the center are options for Q&A and chat. From the beginning of our webinar, you will only be able to view chat messages from the ARC Network team. We will also use the chat to share links to resources and our feedback survey. We will open the chat for participants once we finish the prompted part of our discussion. If you have questions for our speakers, please add them to the Q&A, and you can also upvote questions. To share a little bit about the ARC Network, it's funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program. Building on NSF Advanced Program efforts, the ARC Network aims to connect widely dispersed scholars and practitioners committed to STEM equity in an engaged stakeholder community. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholar program, and online events like this one. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folks experience. The Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN, serves as our home organization. To learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityinstem.org, where you can also join the community if you haven't already. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at ARC Equity in STEM and hashtag Equity in STEM. Now for ARC Network's Project Director, Virginia Rhodes, who will briefly introduce our speakers and moderate today's session. Welcome, Virginia.
Hi, thank you, Heather, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us here today. Today, we're joined by three wonderful panelists, Leah Ceccarelli, Elle Lower, and Desiree Forsyth. So Leah Ceccarelli is a professor in the University of Washington's Department of Communication and a rhetorical critic and theorist. Her research focuses on interdisciplinary and public discourse about science, and she also explores metacritical issues surrounding rhetorical inquiry as a mode of research. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in American Public Address, Rhetorical Criticism, and Rhetoric of Science, and directs the UW Science, Technology, and Society Studies Graduate Certificate Program. Elle Lower is a research associate with the Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System, GLANIS, developing and updating species profiles and maps used to track the spread of non-native species throughout the Great Lakes region. Elle combines experience in stakeholder engagement and science communication to create and promote outreach material on aquatic invasive species and their management efforts at the NOAA Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab in Ann Arbor. Desiree Forsyth is a postdoctoral fellow at Chapman University with a background in both the biological sciences and education. She's a STEM education researcher and focuses on how to disrupt oppressions in the sciences through the use of critical, feminist, and queer theorizations. Desiree has several lines of research, including how those with privileged identities in STEM work at incorporating social justice into pedagogical and professional practice, and how STEM students with marginalized identities experience and navigate STEM environments such as classrooms, advising, and office hours. So that's just a little bit of background about these three panelists today. So going right into the session, the report from this workshop discusses how language and metaphor can reinforce social inequities broadly and in STEM. And can you each introduce yourselves a little bit more than what I've already said and share a few examples with us of this? And let's start with Leah.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Yes, I study the rhetoric of science, which means that I look at how language is used by scientists, both when they speak to other scientists and when they engage in public communication. And the latter has really been my emphasis lately. I've been doing a lot of research on what I call scientist citizens, that is, scientists who see public persuasion about matters for which they have expertise to be a civic responsibility.
Great, thanks. Elle, can you go next?
Sure. Yep, I'm Elle Lower, pronouns are they, them. And yep, I'm based out of NOAA's Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab, where I am the science communication specialist for GLANCIS. Yeah, a lot of my work focuses on basically rhetoric of science stuff. As someone who has been a practitioner for a little while and is often talking to the public, I get to hear a lot about how language is used to communicate about invasive species in particular. That really caught my interest in a major way over the course of the pandemic, when I was realizing just how much, military and nativist language was kind of deeply embedded in our field. And if there weren't better ways that we could talk about invasive species and ecology more generally. So that's been my research for the last little while, is trying to figure out how to discuss invasive species in a way that doesn't fall back on some harmful tropes.
Great, and Desiree.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I am Desiree Forsyth. It's really good to be here. And I think about language in the sciences in kind of two different ways. Like we have our actual problematic words. So when we talk about things in computer science, there's been a long history of things like master and slave, or male and female ends of plugs and technology. So that kinds of stuff. But it's also about how we conceptualize what we teach in science. So I do a lot of how do we bring more social context into the classroom? And so, the ways that we talk about who's in the classroom. So just language shifts like minority to minoritized. So emphasizing the action that's happening, or how we bring about things such as how we talk about queer or sexuality in the classroom, all of that stuff, what is said and what isn't said. So it's like those actual words, but also those concepts, and how do we trouble that? That's what I think about a lot.
Great, thank you all. So as you can see for a little bit from your guys' background, you all deal with language in some way, but you're all a little different in terms of your actual discipline. And I think this workshop did a great job of bringing together other researchers and practitioners from a wide range of fields, and transdisciplinary collaborative work was a theme of this report as well. So what was the workshop experience like, focusing on this topic with so many different people from different fields? And Elle, let's start with you this time.
Sure. Well, I had an absolutely amazing time. I'm usually surrounded by environmental scientists and managers, many of whom have not thought about metaphor since high school English. So at the beginning, when I started getting into this, I was, just talking to my colleagues. It's like, hey, what do you know about the work? Has anyone been doing this kind of work amongst our colleagues? And they were all like, no, this is the first time I've thought about this, actually. I mean, it sounds cool, but, you're going to have to go out and see what's in the literature out there, because I got nothing. Getting together with folks at the conference was so refreshing, because it was so cool to see so many different people across disciplines dealing with some similar issues in their field. I thought it was especially neat to see a lot of the language use actually got me thinking. Some of the things we take for granted, some of the terms we take for granted, like you said, across computer science, across medicine, across ecology, a lot of us are sort of, advocating for the same kinds of changes along different valences here. And it felt very, it was good to be amongst a crowd who was all there for a similar reason. And so you didn't have to lead up with the this is why this is important. You could just jump right into the meat of the topic, and we had some wonderful discussions. So I really enjoyed the heck out of it.
Great. Desiree, did you feel the same way?
I absolutely did. Like, building off of what Elle just said, I think one of the things that I struggle with is, having interdisciplinary backgrounds, which I know a lot of us have, is, in some science spaces, I'm too education, and in some education spaces, I'm too sciencey, and there's not an appreciation of that interdisciplinary sort of thinking. And I felt this group was not only like excited and it embraced that, but encouraged those types of cross disciplines. And it was just so wonderful. I think we often get stuck in our silos, our ways of knowing, and to be able to have conversations with people that had expertise across so many different areas, to me, again, just to mirror Elle's language, was really inspiring. And I think one of the big things that I do both in my research, but just kind of as my passion project, is really bringing social context within science. And it was really nice to see that so many people in the same space really believed that we cannot have science without social context. We have to understand the language and the culture and how we come to this discipline. And that's just as important as teaching, how evolution works and the different pet techniques and things like that. And so it was just really nice to be in a crowd of people who value this work. And not to mention, given how taxing these types of things can be, especially when working in silos, when you're tackling racism and sexism and oppressions against queer people, having a whole bunch of folks that had similar viewpoints about systemic oppression was also really nice and refreshing.
And Leah, what was your experience like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important when you're looking at language and science to have people who are kind of experts in language and people who are experts in the science. And I think that's one of the things that we had. There were, some familiar faces of other people who, like me, work on rhetoric and history of science and philosophy of science. But then there were also people who just had experiences out in the field with the science. And I really think you need those two to work together to come up with solutions. One of the concepts that has been really very important to my research has been metaphor. And that's a concept that I think is used sort of across fields. It's understood in different areas of science studies and also by scientists. One of the things that I really appreciated coming out of this workshop was one of our recommendations in the final report is to, when you look at metaphors, to evaluate them on 3 criteria: on their aptness, their heuristic value, and their equitability. And that's something that I hadn't really, although I've worked a lot on metaphor over the years, I hadn't really thought about evaluating them on those 3 criteria. And that's something that I think came out of the synergy of scientists and scholars who study science that was a part of this metaphor. I mean, a part of this workshop. But the metaphor that really drives my thinking on this is the frontier metaphor. I wrote a whole book on how that metaphor, the myth of the frontier, really influences the way we think about science in both beneficial and really troubling ways. And this set of 3 criteria made me kind of rethink how I had been talking about that. Yes, it's a metaphor that has great heuristic value in authorizing federal funding for scientific research. If scientific research is a new frontier, then just as we funded frontier expeditions in the US, so should we fund basic scientific research. Great at heuristic value, not so good at being apt, right? Because scientific knowledge is not literally a limited resource. Thinking about it as a frontier territory makes you think about it as a land to be claimed, owned. It makes collaboration difficult. It divides scientists from civil society, making them sort of isolated frontiersmen, warrants risky behavior on the frontiers of science. And it is absolutely not equitable. Right? It promotes masculinist attitudes of competition and conquest, the exploitation of indigenous resources. Women and people of color who can't imagine themselves as the Lewis and Clark of genetics or computer science are then unlikely to pursue careers in those fields. So thinking about the heuristic value the aptness and the equitability of a metaphor, something that I really got out of the interdisciplinary conversation that was this workshop.
Great, thanks. And you kind of took us into our next question here. So at the workshop, you broke out into 5 smaller groups to explore research and interventions together in more depth. So what research or interventions do you think are needed to support the use of more inclusive language in STEM? And Desiree, why don't you start us off this time?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is both great and troubling is there's so many places to start and there's so many things to do. And so I think a lot of what I think about, as well as what I worked on at the workshop, was really thinking about pedagogy and curricular approaches. And so if you think across the different curriculum, focusing just on language, where all those those problematic languages come up. So again, we talked about computer science, the way that we name animals, down to the way that we talk about them, but also things like the gypsy moth, like things like that. There are so many points across STEM disciplines where there's problematic language. And I think understanding how that impacts students, where that is, how we look at our textbooks, how we rewrite a lot of our textbooks, the way that that language influences the culture of science, unpacking that for our students and our instructors, pedagogical approaches. So, one of the things that was really nice about this workshop was that a lot of us, while we had different ways of coming at the information, we were mostly on board because we were there working on it, that this is problematic, but not everybody is. So getting folks to be on board with all of this revamping, there is so much research and so much practice that has to be changed. And so I think leaving that workshop, I would say almost all of my research has started to shift into how do we address this almost sometimes one discipline at a time, thinking about there's just a vast array of things that have to be done. And there's people doing great work. There was a collaboration by Ellie Theobald and some other folks that were really looking at curriculum, and I believe it was biology textbooks, and the way they talked about environmental science and some of the inclusive language or non-inclusive language, and really kind of dissecting that. And so there's a lot of folks that are thinking about these things in the field as well.
Great. Leah, what do you have to say to this question here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think unsurprisingly, when you get a bunch of knowledge workers together, we're going to tell you that we need to do more research, right? That's and that's what we basically did, right? We need to do more research into the effects of problematic language use in STEM. We need to do more research into what to do to eliminate problematic language use in STEM, and we need to do more research into how to persuade people that this sort of thing is important. And I think that's great. That makes sense to me, speaking my language. But part of me fears that too much focus on research could turn our focus away from necessary action, right? More research can be a kind of delaying tactic after all, right? For people who don't want to actually institute change, they, let's just research it some more. Now, I know that the people gathered at that workshop were not interested in waiting. They want change. They want change now. So I'm not too worried that more research will turn into less action. But I do think we need to, keep working on moving what we've already learned from our research into actual productive change.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. Elle, what are your thoughts? What research or interventions do you think are needed to support?
Well, Leah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because I've been doing a lot of thinking about how to operationalize the things that we were discussing and that we've learned in the new research that is coming out. There's a lot of ongoing research here, and it's been amazing to kind of get plugged into that literature community that's not just, analyzing sea lamprey distribution patterns in the Great Lakes. It's a fun change of pace for me. But one thing that I really took away from this, and one area that I've actually been working in pretty strongly, is how do we find institutional support for these changes? I think there was a conversation at the workshop where we were talking about, having our hands on the cultural levers, and how do we move those levers in a beneficial and socially positive direction? And the answer to that is it has to start with conversation. So the good news is after this workshop, I was able to come back to my organization, which is Michigan Sea Grant, but I'm also a part of the broader Sea Grant community. I'm not sure if any of you know too much about that, but it's sort of it's a boundary organization. We work with a lot of government on state, federal, and local level. We work with academia, and we're the aquatic side of extension, more or less. So we bring research out to the communities and try to operationalize it, the communities in which we're based. We've gotten some really wonderful conversations going on at Sea Grant about how we as a boundary organization can maybe be the people to bring this information like to the communities and to research communities as well. To the point where we've actually gotten some grant funding to do so. There's been increased interest in bringing kind of these social science conversations about inclusivity and DJ work in STEM to some of the big conferences in our field. I know we're doing something at ICASE next year, which is an aquatic invasive species conference. We do it at IAGLA, which is Great Lakes specific. And it's really wonderful to see more and more people kind of buying in here as we broadcast this information, and folks who had maybe never thought about it before are like, wait a second, I have a problem. Maybe we can solve it together. And so that's been incredibly cool. There's still definitely some tough nuts to crack. There's some folks who are still, whether they know it or not, kind of actively impeding some of this work when it comes to especially name change. That's a very complicated topic in taxonomy, especially. Scientific names change regularly, but the common names listed amongst species, particularly for fish, can be a bit of a problem if there is someone involved in an institution who is not on board necessarily with name changes for inclusion efforts. So trying to figure out how we navigate that and not let that stop us as more and more organizations kind of sign on to this has been an interesting part of this journey here. So the good news is the work is being done, and the more research we have to support it, the stronger our case is. So it's to the point where, say, I'm part of the Great Lakes panel on aquatic nuisance species. We actually are we've recently put out a position statement on inclusive language that we are sending all the way up to the National Aquatic Nuisance Species Task Force to say, hey, let's be mindful of the words we use. Let's promote, inclusive naming and inclusive metaphor in our outreach material and try to set some standards for that. So it is exciting to see that moving along and getting much bigger than I anticipated.
That's great. Yeah, I think it kind of echoes Leah's point earlier, where you need people who know the language and know the science, and having those two groups together along with that institutional support, I think is what's going to help us make those changes in the future. So a lot has happened legally, politically, socially since this workshop has happened, with growing restrictions placed on language that aims to be inclusive and equitable. And we've also seen some examples of more inclusive language being adopted by some STEM fields. So what do you see as areas of progress and challenge since this workshop? And Leah, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Yes, I think areas of progress and challenge are, as the area metaphor suggests, geographical. I feel very fortunate to be living in a blue state in Washington, in Seattle in Washington. And it's just a lot of the people around me are trying very hard to be very sensitive to language choices that might harm marginalized communities. But I really fear that initiatives like ours are being weaponized in some other locations of the United States as evidence of the woke pieties of liberal intellectuals. When places like Florida and Texas are banning the teaching of history that makes white students uncomfortable, the very idea of thoughtfully changing our language choices in STEM it's open to ridicule, at best, threats to people's careers at worst. So I think a lot has happened legally, politically, socially since we met, and not a lot of it good. And so I'm very, very concerned about how to frame our project in a way that makes it capable of being heard not just by like-minded fellows, but by those in places where the idea of inclusivity is really under attack.
Yeah, Elle, what do you see as areas of progress and challenge here?
Well, I certainly want to second that, because you can't always choose where research organizations are geographically located in the US, and it's deeply and profoundly unfair that a lot of people are finding themselves hampered simply because of, say, state level politics. I work closely with the team out of USGS in Gainesville, so they're very on board with, say, some of the species name changes. They are running into, we're going to have to approach that very, very carefully, given the political landscape that they themselves are working in. And we understand the process must maybe much slower for them than it is for us in Michigan, which is quite a solidly blue state these days, which is quite a relief. The good news is we're still able to bring people together, whether virtually or in person, and there is active interest in continuing to fund this work. I'm very proud to say that I'm part of a group with Sea Grant, working with both Michigan Sea Grant, Wisconsin, and an Oregon Sea Grant, or Washington Sea Grant. We actually just got, we're running a grant-funded workshop in Washington, D.C. in parallel with National Invasive Species Awareness Week in February to bring together professionals who do work around science communication to discuss areas that we can improve the rhetoric and the species naming conventions that we use. So we're reaching outside the Great Lakes. This is intended to be a national level thing. I will, of course, be in touch with this group here because I think you would all be great participants, or if you wanted to be involved. But it is exciting to see that people are still funding opportunities like this, because it's recognized that actually this really is important to a lot of folks still, even as we kind of find the tone shifting in some parts of the country here. We need to keep up the work while we can, and try to lay the groundwork for inclusivity in the face of all that.
Well, congrats and good luck with your work in the future, because that's coming up really soon. Desiree, what are some areas of progress and challenge that you've seen since the workshop?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So you're talking about sort of the operationalization. Operating. What we do with research is I do a lot of professional development with a lot of different colleagues, working with HHMI, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, among many others, to bring socially relevant material and include social context within STEM. And one of the difficulties we're finding over the past couple of years, and it's just getting worse, is you can help folks understand how to hold these conversations in their classroom. You can help folks shape their curriculum. You can help, think about language, but to be very, very careful, especially for our K-12 educators, to make sure that we aren't doing things that will cause them to lose their jobs. It's becoming much, much more difficult to just run a professional development because everybody's geographical, space that they're living in, it's going to impact them differently. So not only do we have to consider identities and how identities are impacted when teaching this content, but we now also have to really be mindful of the laws that are targeting a lot of what we're doing. And so I think a lot of the challenges are how do we disseminate these kinds of materials and help folks along through the challenges while doing it broadly, but also being very mindful of the very different contexts that folks are experiencing. So that's definitely in my own realm. I think some of the progress, though, is I have found more and more folks being vocal supporters of wanting to reshape their curricular materials or wanting to reshape and rethink about things. I think I've seen a lot more of, not to say that the generations above are coming from like a problematic space, but sometimes the old guard has, created boundaries, especially those who have more privileged identities. And I'm seeing a lot more vocalization from younger faculty also coming through and saying, like, we don't want this anymore. We want to be inclusive in our classrooms. We believe that pronouns are something we should be using. And that's been really refreshing too. I think there's going to be, and as there continues to be, a clash in these ideologies, unfortunately, as we move forward. And I never thought I'd have to pay attention as much to the specific languages of law that I have to now when running a professional development. That's a very new space for me. I feel like I have to understand what are the parameters that we can operate within. So yeah, that challenging on progress.
Great. Well, that's actually the end of our prepared questions, but I have a question for you before we get into this Q&A. And so kind of talking about taking this workshop and the research that you all have done and translating that into more action steps. So what are you all doing personally and professionally to kind of move this work forward? And Desiree, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I guess a couple of things that I do on a day-to-day is, again, running a lot of those professional developments. So what I do is center difficult dialogues inside of STEM. And so how do we have conversations around the historical oppressions and the current day oppressions of science? Because we believe that the social context matters just as much as the sort of textbook definitions and things that we need to memorize. Those are also important, but we have to know that I think a lot of scientists like to come to science as an objective discipline, but we have to center the humanity in that. And without that centering of humanity, those oppressions will continue to exist, whether that's racism in healthcare, whether that's the language that we have, whether that's an exclusive culture for folks who are not identifying as white, cisgender men, all of those things. And so a lot of what I do is that professional development, but also researching how folks sort of come into these justice areas. So what are the things in life that have to happen for you to become aware of a justice, and how does that translate to your pedagogy and curriculum? And then using that information to do empirically grounded professional development. So those are the kind of two areas that I think about and tackle.
Pretty awesome. Leah, let's turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, as I sort of said at the beginning, I've really been thinking a lot about the scientist as citizens. So one of the things that I've been really working on lately is trying to empower scientists to really think of themselves as not just existing in the technical sphere, but also being members of a broader civic space, and helping scientists to really recognize that participating in that civic space is not a bad thing, right? We say, oh, you don't want the politicization of science. Science and politics should be completely separate. Well, maybe, but that's not the way it is, right? Because we are all scientists and citizens. We are all people in a broader community. And so that's kind of been my work lately is I don't want to just come down as a humanities scholar and say, this is the language you should use and this is the language you shouldn't use. Instead, I want to say here is how you can use some of the means of persuasion that are available to you as a scientist rhetor to speak to others and really get your voice out there.
Great. And Elle, what about you?
Yeah, I think I touched on this with some of my previous answers, but we're really trying to, actually do the work through a lot of the organizations that I'm partnered with, and through Sea Grant itself, which can facilitate some of these discussions. One thing that's been kind of a sleeper hit is I have basically made this sort of living Google spreadsheet of whenever I come across interesting papers that maybe my colleagues would not read, because they have to do with rhetoric of science, best practices for education, stuff like that. I throw it in the document with a quick blurb, and that is freely shared. Anyone can add to it. And it's basically kind of a little living library of, would you like to catch up on some of the theory that's going on and some of the developments going on in how we can do SciComm and science education better? Check out this list of resources so you don't have to go into Google Scholar completely unprepared. And a lot of folks have found some utility in that, and it started a lot of good discussions amongst the groups that I work with. So that's been exciting here.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, having that just curated resources is so helpful. And I feel like in any field, especially a field that's so interdisciplinary, when like language covers all different sorts of disciplines. And so having a document you can go to look up resources, I think would be very helpful. So I do want to open it up to the audience for Q&A, and it looks like we do have a question from Joan Herbers. So what is the state of our understanding of how non-suitable jargon affects others? In other words, how can we persuade users that their choice of words is harmful? And I will open up to any of our three panelists who wants to take on that question.
I think I can jump in real quick. Maybe not so much as jargon specifically, but just thinking about language in general. There's been a lot of research done on things like queer topics in STEM, and the way that we present curriculum as very binary, or the examples we use as who we call parents, these kinds of things. There's been research that shows that students who identify as queer feel very isolated in this curriculum. They don't see themselves. Some of it's just wrong in the way that we conflate gender and sex. So we have examples of that. And it shows, the research shows that it's also reinforcing those binary understandings to students who don't have like sexuality that's outside of hetero. So I think there is a lot of research that you can hear students' experiences and say that I left STEM or I left this space because I didn't see myself, the curriculum did not represent me, and the teachers didn't respect me. So that's one example.
One thing that's been particularly useful when talking with other researchers is just the power of anecdote and good storytelling. I mean, you can show people research papers all day, but sometimes you just have to sit down and talk with them about, for instance, when I am talking about, so invasive carp are often called Asian carp. It's 4 different species. It really doesn't make sense to lump these 4 species together. They all have very different life histories, different impacts on the Great Lakes. We have a whole series of stories about how that has negatively impacted folks. My colleagues at Minnesota Sea Grant, for instance, tell the story of how some visiting scholars from China came into the Minnesota airport and were seeing, grass carp, which are quite frankly a treasured fish in their native habitat in China. There were these big signs everywhere like, kill Asian carp, the war on Asian carp. Like, Asian carp are evil. And it was just like very jarring for these scholars. And they're like, wow, this is like incredibly uncomfortable to us, actually. And they had this long talk with the invasive species community of practice about that. And it really drove home like how using the term invasive carp rather than like jumping to continent of origin was a simple change that could really make a lot of people like less on edge and really facilitate stronger and like more well-supported international discussion. So those kinds of stories are so incredibly valuable. You can show people statistics all day, but I really feel like the storytelling aspect has, at least when talking to other researchers about this, really gotten them thinking. They're like, wait a second, we had a conversation like this, like somewhere down the line, maybe this is a thing that we need to bring up a little more often and be proactive about. So yeah, never underestimate the power of a good anecdote.
Yeah. And Leah, do you have anything you'd like to add to this question?
I mean, I guess I just like the idea of the story and the anecdote. I think that we really need to think about this as a case-based matter, just to say sort of in general, non-suitable jargon affects others in a negative way is not going to be very useful. But in particular cases, I think that's the kind of a lot of research has been done. We need to look at those particular cases and share those stories. So I think that actually leads us to the question, one of the questions. So
I was going to jump into just on Elle's comment as well. I think I was just talking to a researcher who I'm not a plant biologist, but was talking about a non-native species that no one will fund research on because it's labeled as invasive, which is kind of gives this term that it's bad, but it actually is doing a lot of good things for the environment, given that the environment is heating up. So it's providing shade for animals in different ways. And so we're even missing like understanding the good impacts of species because of the way that we label them. And so I found that to be fascinating.
So another question, kind of tying into this, shifting gears towards the more corporate side, though. They find it difficult to convince corporate scientists and engineers the importance of inclusive language in technical documents. And they ask where they can find resources with talking points to emphasize this importance, and what research has been done to show any impacts of inclusive language in corporate documentation. Anyone here? Because I don't have the answers.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know the corporate side at all. I'm wondering if we can pull from like academia, at least as when it comes to like student retention of learners, as Desiree was saying, and people feeling like the whole leaky pipeline effect for marginalized people. Well, we all know that that metaphor is troubled as well. Yeah, but I don't know anything about the corporate side of things, and maybe we should reach out and bring that kind of community of practitioners in as well. We deal with that a lot less in environmental science because mostly it's NGOs and then various levels of governance and volunteer groups. But I'd be curious to see if anyone has any insights on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would like to see like the specific case again to see if there has been research done on that. I mean, the one that comes to my mind is a case that I studied that I talked about in my book on the frontier of science metaphor of bioprospecting being used to really get pharmaceutical companies excited about doing research on, basic taxonomy, which can be pretty boring stuff. But it becomes very exciting when you see it as a prospecting venture, right? Because you're going to be, lots of money is going to be coming out of that. How harmful that language actually ended up being, because as soon as you start talking about scientific research as a kind of bioprospecting, then you got people worried about the colonialist impulse and the acquisition of intellectual property so, for example, E.O. Wilson used that term to get people excited about doing research, and then in the Brazilian Amazon, and the result was that Brazil put restrictions on anyone coming from outside of Brazil to do research in the Amazon because they didn't want their resources bioprospected. So I guess that's one specific case in which I think about corporate science using that language in a way that was not actually productive for the corporations.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I spent some time in like computer science and doing computer science ethics and teaching social impacts, and I feel like computer science has a lot of overlap, which engineering has a lot of overlap with those competitive metaphors, war metaphors, a lot of sort of masculinity that comes through, and we can just look at who is working in these disciplines, and that shows that there is a culture of exclusion, right? So if you look at folks who are non-men in computer science, the numbers are very small. And so if there is an extrapolation of the way that we talk about the discipline and the way that we come at the discipline and then who's in the discipline, I think that's another way of convincing folks that perhaps a language and a culture shift is needed because we are not representing all genders at all in those spaces, or all identities, again, except usually cisgender white men.
Definitely. So our next question here is, do you have any articles or resources that have really shaped your thinking and activism around inclusive language in STEM? And feel free to chime in.
Well, I would encourage anyone who hasn't read the ARC Network report yet to go ahead and do that, because I think that one of its strongest qualities is some of the literature that it cites. So being able to hand someone a bibliography to say, would you like to learn more? Check this out. Guess what? And then again, going back to some of the articles that I've kind of been compiling in this inclusive language LibGuide is what I've been referring to it as. Got some librarian friends. Yeah, there's been different kind of sort of, I feel like inclusive language and sort of this rhetoric of science stuff has sort of flushed like mushrooms at various points through the last 20, 30 years in particular. Two pieces that were particularly influential to me were, I think, Baru Subramanian's The Aliens Have Landed piece, which was all about basically xenophobia in invasive species language. And then there's just a whole bunch of other really interesting articles. Brendan Larson, who was also a participant in the actual ARC Network meeting that we had in San Diego, wrote a whole book on metaphor in environmental science, and it was very cool to meet him in person, but would highly recommend reading through some of his stuff. Yes, and I would be happy to share that link. Like I said, it's all very rough and just kind of thrown together, but I welcome anyone adding anything to it. As long as you're not deleting resources, please have at it. I'll go pull that up and drop that in the chat.
Desiree or Leah, you have any resources or articles?
I think there's so many things that are so exciting to share. One of the ones that inspired me, and really the reason that I got in touch with this group is I used to work in Brian Dewsbury's lab, and one of his graduate students at the time, Cynthia Taylor, wrote a really amazing paper, and I can drop it in, and it's all about basically the good things and the bad things of using metaphors in science. And I think that was one of those really interesting papers that gets you kind of thinking about all the ways that this comes together. And so if I had to pick one, I think that paper is super interesting.
Yeah, I just want to reinforce Elle's recommendation to look at the report, because there's an appendix at the very end of the report that lists examples of some language that some that has successfully shifted and some that has not yet successfully shifted. And so, as I understand the questioner asking, how can we be sure we're being inclusive and equitable? Well, this is one way of doing it, is to take a look at this list. And I believe that is an ongoing document that we continue to add to it.
Yes, that's right. And we'll be dropping the link to the report in the chat at the end of this session for people to read and to provide any feedback on the entire report itself, or to provide terms that that may be problematic. We have a form for that on that link as well. So another attendee asks if you know of any resources to help run metaphors and phrases by someone as an audit to be sure we're being inclusive and equitable.
I think this is very case dependent, personally, and I think that all of the resources we're sharing are good places to start, becoming more and more educated on these topics. I think we risk saying that there is a specific audit or a person that you should go to do and understand specific languages. I think that's a little bit tricky because they're so context dependent. So I think my recommendation would really just to be reading what's out there, to be engaging in these conversations with folks that do this or are interested in talking about this. But I'm not sure I would ever say that there is one specific resource that we could kind of funnel these through.
And then another question. So what are some suggestions that you have for reporting background research that has an equitable language? For example, a lot of existing research about STEM and equities have deficit-oriented language toward minoritized groups, achievement gaps, etc. And it can be very difficult to report the relevant findings in an asset-framed way instead.
I could jump in one more time. I don't want to just keep hearing my voice. But I think on this one, this is really something I think about all the time, especially the way that we represent queer and trans folks in research, and just to cite past studies and then to try to use more inclusive language in the studies that we're doing now. A lot of times, if I'm doing the research myself, I can write a sort of like a footnote or something like, this is what I do. But when I'm referencing old studies, if it's not deeply problematic, I'll use their language. And if I do use their language, I will, let the readers know that I'm using it because that's what reflects in their studies. If it's deeply problematic, then I just update the language and let folks know. So one of those places is trying to move from the terminology colorblind to color evasive. And so just letting folks know of that shift in language when writing those papers. And so it's tricky. I don't know if there's ever a really good answer, but I think until we get to the space of where folks will recognize the new language or metaphors, we have to address it in both places so that we can kind of bring folks along on that journey.
And Leah or Al, do you have some suggestions for this person?
We're still working on that. I find that in my work, I am often the person that people reach out to because I am the point of contact, which is obviously a lot of pressure. I think that finding a list of resources that people can direct things to would be very helpful, and not sort of like putting that on a person who happens to be marginalized on any number of axes and sort of being like the person to speak for all marginalized groups. This has happened from time to time. I, for instance, as a white person, I'm non-binary and queer. I can speak on those issues. I can speak on some other issues. I cannot speak as an expert on the issue of race, for instance. And I would much prefer to not try to kind of overstep that on that front, and to have somebody who is willing to do that kind of work and have that be an appropriate kind of work for them to do is very good. Or having a list of resources, or again, kind of a LibGuide to direct people to, would be very, very helpful to have readily accessible for folks who do want to sort of have a sensitivity reader for some of their work.
All right, well, we're coming to the close here. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A at the moment. So I guess, what were your guys's not takeaways, I guess. What would you like to share to the audience as we close this panel out today?
I guess I just feel like we still have so much more work to do. This, last question especially makes me think, we need another workshop to come up with these resources to pass along. So I just hope that this work, even though I said we don't need to do so much research that we're not doing action, I do really feel like we need to do more work, more research that is action oriented.
One thing on my mind, of course, is supporting people who are doing this work to be sure that they are not, trolled out of their fields. That's definitely a thing that we will be talking about at the DC workshop, is basically how institutions can lend support to people doing, DJ work, and sort of offering supports for them if there is backlash to that. And also how organizations can maybe sort of band together and present a little bit more of a united front, so that no individual or small group gets targeted by, again, trolls in this increasingly peculiar political landscape we find ourselves in. So that is very much on my mind, because I want everyone to be safe while doing good work.
I think for me, a major takeaway or thing that I think about is the balance of resistance versus community, and how we really have to put these things together. Resistance as far as, you know, what we're all talking about, trying to become more inclusive, resisting terrible policies or politics, but also community, and that this is complex. People are complex and they hold so many different identities and experiences that we can't just say that somebody is this person because they have one political belief over here. I think it's really this idea that we have to continue to work together while also being resistant. And that's really difficult to do. And every day I wake up and what that looks like is a little bit different for me. So it's definitely a journey.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here and for answering these questions. I know it's hard and it's hard work. So keep on going on is what I'll leave you guys with. And I'll turn it over to Heather now to close out this webinar.
Thank you so much for an amazing panel. Thank you to our audience for joining us today. We just wanted to share a couple of announcements before closing out. So in the chat, you're going to be receiving a link to our survey for the webinar today. You'll also be receiving a link to our Emerging Research Workshop report where you can read more about what you heard today. We also, on the link to the report, have, as Virginia mentioned, a link to a Google form where if you have some language that you'd like to see change, you can document that through that form, and we'll be sharing that back out with the community. We also have the opportunity for you to answer all of the questions, the discussion questions that we went through at the Emerging Research Workshop to contribute to the next iteration of our report. We may have things missing. We only have about 20 to 25 people attend each of these workshops, and we can always add more in terms of the perspectives that we're bringing to the table. So please take a look at that. And with that, I will thank you for attending and close out this webinar.